I'm Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. Later this month, on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Brussels, two men will meet. One of them is the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, who has been the leader, either as president or prime minister, since 2002. The other is Joe Biden, US president, since January. But those differences in timescales is probably very artificial, because in between these two men have been not just years, but arguably decades of issues in Turkish-US politics, which some see as reaching a critical point. The possibility of American sanctions on Turkey over its use, purchase of advanced anti-aircraft missile systems from Russia, questions about Turkish pursuit of resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, which has been criticized and possibly sanctioned by Europe, questions about the region, from Syria to Libya to the Gulf states and beyond, such as the issue of Armenia, both symbolically and very real with the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So what do we expect from this meeting? And beyond this meeting, what are the issues that are in play for the rest of this year and beyond? I need some help here. So I'm going to turn to Sinan Ülgen. Sinan Ülgen has been a man who's worked in various sectors with great success. He's a former diplomat with the Turkish Foreign Service. So he has seen this from the inside, as it were, with diplomatic postings in areas throughout the world. He has seen it working in the economic sector, a founding partner of Istanbul Economics, chairman of the Center for Economics and Policy Studies. And he's seen it as an analyst on a day-to-day basis, for example, as a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, and as a contributor to both Turkish and international media, such as his regular articles for Bloomberg. Mr. Ülgen, thank you so much for helping me out here on World Unfiltered.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott, for hosting me today.
Let me start with this meeting, which has received a lot of attention, I see, in Turkish media, but not as much, interestingly, as mainstream American media. And we might consider why that is later. But what do you expect from this encounter between Biden and Erdoğan? Will it be just simply an introductory, how are you, ice-breaking meeting? Or will we see substantial discussion of issues in this encounter in Brussels?
Well, I think we need to be aware that there are different expectations in Washington and in Ankara about this particular meeting. First of all, we need to underline that this will be the first time that the two presidents shall meet in person. Of course, Biden, being a long-serving politician, has already met Erdoğan on a number of occasions. But as the president of the United States, it will be the first time for this meeting. So in that sense, it's going to be the maiden meeting of the two presidents. On the Turkish side, the expectations are high that this meeting will lead to a new roadmap for the future of the Turkey-US relationship. As you've mentioned in your introductory remarks, there are a number of unresolved problems, disputes, bilateral disputes between Turkey and the US. And since January 20th, none of these issues have really been addressed. And on the contrary, one might argue that the messaging from Washington has become more hawkish on some of these issues, and we certainly can discuss this in more detail today, perhaps. So that is the perception in Washington, whereas in Ankara, there is a lot of importance attached to this meeting, with the hope that this can really lead to a new area in the Turkey-US relationship, not necessarily resolving the issues overnight, obviously, but at least it could engineer, introduce an era where the two sides can constructively address the bilateral issues. And here I want to go back about, why the expectations are different. In Ankara, the expectation, the hope perhaps, is that the US, after this meeting, will agree to have a quote unquote a grand bargain with Turkey. Now, what that means is that the US will agree to address every issue that has come to bedevil this relationship and basically engage in a trade-off, in a negotiation on each of those issues, on S-400, on the YPG relationship, possibly on Halkbank, and a number of other bilateral issues, these being the more important ones. That's the viewpoint in Ankara. The viewpoint until now from Washington is very different. In Washington, Turkey obviously is viewed as an ally, being a NATO member, but nonetheless is a problematic ally. And therefore, the approach which I've seen until with the Biden administration has really been to treat Turkey not so much as an ally, but as a difficult partner, and adopt the same type of engagement strategy that the administration has been championing for China and Russia. What is this engagement strategy? It is one where we basically agree to disagree on a number of areas. That can be human rights, that can be, Russian policy abroad, that can be China's assertiveness, but also find areas where we can establish common ground and cooperate. That can be climate change with China, that can be stabilization in Syria with Russia, and so on. So the administration, it seems to me, is intent on employing the same type of engagement strategy with Turkey and treat Turkey differently than other allies within the transatlantic alliance. This shows how much ground actually Turkey has lost in the United States, and in particular with this administration. So these are the two very different viewpoints that will clash, and we shall obviously see what the outcome shall be, whether it's going to be closer to Turkey's expectation, or the US will continue to hold this view that the engagement with Turkey should be limited to areas where there can be common efforts.
While you've written that even a divorce is even possible, and you've actually said because of both sides, but you spoke there in a sense that in Washington's eyes, Turkey has lost ground. Where did Turkey lose ground? Was it specifically over the deal for the S-400 missiles from Russia? Was it over another issue, or is it just a general sense that they're tired of Erdoğan?
Well, it's all of the above, but there's another, I think, important dynamic to underline here, which is not related to Turkey at all. Mm-hmm. And that is how the US and the Biden administration sees the world. When you look at the initial policy statements by the Biden administration, but also in the focus of and essentially an effort to contain the rise. Of course, Russia is also a factor, but let's say if you give 10 to China in terms of its importance in US foreign policy, Russia would score at most a 2. So it's all about, the East Asia strategy. It's all about containing China. And as a result of which, the strategic focus of this administration has clearly shifted to this region, which we should recall is not new in terms of US strategic thinking. We should go back and, we can also remind the phrase that the Obama administration used, pivot to Asia, which did, create a number of, reactions within the transatlantic alliance, in particular in Europe. It never really happened full-fledged, but already we could see that the strategic vision, the strategic focus had been shifting. Now it's become very clear. And therefore, in this world where the US strategic focus is clearly centered on East Asia and China, relatively speaking, the other regions, and in particular the Middle East, which is the geography where Turkey derives its geopolitical importance,
has really been undermined in terms of its strategic importance in U.S. Strategic thinking. And that's the secular trend, I would argue, that is undermining Turkey's importance as a geopolitical ally in Washington, just because the strategic focus is not what it used to be. That's one factor which is, independent of Turkey. The others, as you mentioned, they are, policy-driven, Turkey-driven factors. And then it's a combination. It's about, the steady erosion of the rule of law in Turkey, which is giving, which is certainly laying the ground for a Democrat administration to be more hawkish, more critical on Turkey. It's about the, Turkey's past and perhaps current efforts of realignment with Russia, including the acquisition of the S-400. So there are a number of factors there, but ultimately it's really a combination of those two. So the secular trend that the strategic focus of the United States is clearly shifting to another region, which undermines Turkey's perception as a geostrategic ally. And the other, more Turkey-related dynamics, which currently do not work in favor of those who want to see a closer relationship between the two.
That's interesting. So in a sense, whereas there's almost in a sense a priority of the U.S. in Turkish perceptions at this point, Turkey's not necessarily top of the line when it comes to what the Biden administration is looking like.
Yeah, and I think just to add, and I think this is the discrepancy. I don't know if the Turkish leadership has fully acknowledged what is happening in Washington in terms of a strategic focus, because for long Turkey was used to leveraging its geopolitical importance in its relationship with the United States. But that geopolitical importance, at least viewed from Washington, is not what it used to be. And that's going to create, I believe, some difficult backdrop to the relationship going forward.
Yeah, and certainly what I've noticed in the past, well, since the summit was announced in late April, is that there's been a great deal of coverage in the Turkish press, great deal of speculation as to what might happen. I've seen almost nothing from the mainstream media apart from your articles for Bloomberg in the United States. So that disparity has been there. Let me ask you with respect to that then, that if we're talking about your idea, and you've written also about the grand reset in U.S.-Turkish relations. So if we're going to talk about a grand reset, or at least the possibility of one, in U.S.-Turkish relations, does it have to start with a unilateral gesture from the Turks? For example, yes, we'll make a concession on the S-400s, we'll make the technical arrangements where this is firewalled away from NATO, we'll send more of the Russian advisors home.
There still seems to be a bridge or a divide that needs to be bridged between Washington and Ankara, because so far the messaging from Washington insinuates that it is up to Turkey to take that first step, and that first step has to be on the S-400 issue. The S-400 issue has now acquired a symbolic, if you want, importance that may not be commensurate with the importance of the system militarily, but it's now being seen as a sign almost of the willingness of the Turkish government to enhance its relations with its NATO allies, and particularly with the United States. This is coupled with the hardening of the stance in Washington, which now has shifted to the wording of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, adopted by Congress in December 2020, which essentially says that the CAATSA sanctions, which were imposed on account of this transaction, can only be lifted if Turkey seizes ownership of the system. That's become the new threshold, the new yardstick, the new benchmark. But obviously that is politically very, very difficult for Turkey across the horizon, has the best system after or the best human invention after apple pie, and therefore it's very difficult for the Turkish government to really accept this requirement of going or taking the extreme measure of getting rid of the system. So I think what Turkey will try to do is to convince the US administration about another formula, a face-saving formula, if you want, where this would be kept under wraps. There would be a verification mechanism. Turkey and the US would agree on the conditions under which the system would be utilized in the future, which would be linked to a severe security crisis, obviously. So these type of negotiations, finding a formula that the Turkish government can explain to the Turkish public after having backed this system for so long and so strenuously. And this is going to be the real, if you want, stumbling block on whether, and a lot of the near-term shape of the relationship will actually be shaped by whether Washington can be convinced to have this sort of negotiations with Turkey about the future status of the S-400 system, or whether the meeting on the 14th of June, the US president will sort of stick to his guns and continue with the very hawkish attitude that the only conditions under which this issue can be addressed is if Turkey accepts to seize ownership of the system.
Okay, so that's an important symbolic issue, but it's one that might give us our first signal. Let me ask you about a couple of other issues. Let me go to the substantive issue of Syria. On the one hand, we've got Turkey, who sees the leading Syrian Kurdish faction, the PYD, as being allied with the Kurdish insurgency PKK. Therefore, I would assume it's demanding that the US break completely with that Syrian Kurdish leadership. On the other hand, the United States has invested a lot in being alongside the Kurds with the effort to remove the Islamic State. We now have a Kurdish autonomous area in northeast Syria, and we have the return of a man named Brett McGurk, who had been there during the Obama administration, has come back, and is very much a pro-Kurdish official, or is seen as a pro-Kurdish official, and he's the head of the US Middle Eastern policy in the region. Is there any way to navigate between a Turkish position that the US has to cut itself off completely from the Syrian Kurdish leadership, and a US which practically is alongside that leadership, both politically and of course with the US military, which is still in Syria?
We certainly need another panel to be able to, intelligently discuss this very thorny issue. But let me just try to be, brief about it. Let's recall that when this relationship was established between the United States and the PYD-YPG, the United States was fully aware of the type of damage that this could do to the bilateral relationship. And therefore, the messaging was that this relationship was going to be temporary, tactical, and transactional. Over time, however, this is not what we have seen. Over time, the relationship between the United States and the Syrian and Kurdish entity has become more than transactional, more than tactical, and very possibly more than temporary. So that is at the core of the difficulty, because fundamentally, I think Turkey has, a very legitimate argument that, this is an offshoot of the PKK. The PKK is a terrorist entity recognized as such both in Turkey and in the United States. So how can the United States have this relationship, this structured relationship with an entity that is seen as a threat to Turkey's national security, Turkey, a NATO ally? So that's, in its simple form, the argument that you hear on the Turkish side, and it also happens to be one of the core drivers of the rising anti-Americanism in Turkey. When people go on TV to talk about this relationship, in a couple of minutes, you very rapidly end up with a reference, and rightly so, to the U.S. relationship with the YPG-PYD. So I think on the U.S. side, whether it is Brad McCurk or others, I think they have slightly is not the right term, but grossly perhaps underestimated the damage that this could end up doing to the bilateral relationship. The thinking on the U.S. side may have been, okay, this is a difficult relationship, but we can manage the ties with Turkey while still doing business with the PYD. And I think there's a fallacy there. So, and as long as the U.S. continues in not wanting to reassess its relationship with the PYD, that is going to become remain very toxic as a bilateral issue. So I think, where do we go from here? We obviously, what Turkey wants would be a full permanent end to this relationship. Politically speaking, that may not be feasible for the U.S. administration to deliver, but at least there can be a number of interim steps that the U.S. should contemplate. One would be to reassure Turkey about the objective of this relationship, and when and under what conditions the U.S. would withdraw politically, not just militarily, and end this relationship. That's one. The second one is on the military side. There's also a lot of grounded criticism that the U.S. has been supplying weapons to this YPG, which allegedly is to be used in the fight against the Islamic State. But who can guarantee that these weapons are not going to be used against Turkey through and basically delivered to the PKK? So I think there needs to be more transparency as well on the U.S. side about this weapons program. Again, here I want to go back and recall that one of the U.S. promises to Turkey were that these weapons would be tracked, and there would be a weapons buyback program after the fight, after the end of the fight with the Islamic State. We haven't seen this in practice, so there can certainly be a room for this type of confidence building in terms of the weapons buyback. Now, that's on the U.S. side. On the Turkish side, obviously, the U.S. expectation is that Turkey should go back to the pre-2015 attitude or engagement, where Turkey would talk to the PYD about the security situation in Syria, about the future of Syria, and basically differentiate between the PYD and the PKK. Now, I don't think this is possible with this government. But it is also this government, let's recall, that did initiate what is called the peace process in Turkey, and talked to these representatives of the Kurdish wing. So I think that's where we have a number of uncertainties that would be still useful to reassess in terms of the future of the policy, both in Washington and in Ankara.
Okay, I'm not quite sure I can see the light at the end of the tunnel on that, but
it's very difficult. As things stand, it's very difficult, but I'm still trying to create some optimism going forward by underlining the areas where I think it may be politically feasible to take some interim steps.
Okay, well, let me take that glimmer then and go to the Eastern Mediterranean, where again there's a bit of an imbalance. This is a very key issue for Turkey in terms of the control of resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's very little that's said about it in mainstream U.S. politics. However, it's not just countries in the region that are very concerned or that are involved. Israel, for example. The European Union is also concerned, possibly because Greece has an interest in those resources as well. And the EU has threatened, or at least has said, we might start looking at sanctions over the East Mediterranean issue, which is linked to that of Cyprus. Is it the case that this is not an issue that is likely to come up in a U.S.-Turkish framework, that the Americans are quite happy to stand back from the Eastern Mediterranean and let others, such as the Europeans, take the lead?
Yes, it certainly seems so that, this U.S. administration is more intent on allowing Europeans to play a bigger role in what they see as Europe's backyard. And the Eastern Mediterranean is indeed an area where you have two EU member states, Greece and Cyprus, and Turkey, a candidate to EU membership, that have this, this dispute. So I think so far the U.S. has been relatively happy in taking, in taking less interest in this issue and allowing the Europeans, the EU in particular, to play a more substantive role. And it's really been the EU on the driver's seat. We've seen the different conclusions coming out of the EU Council last year with the threat of sanctions against Turkey, and then this year in March with a more positive assessment given Turkey's, changed stance with, with a more balanced approach and the start of the direct exploratory talks between Turkey and Greece. So I think on Eastern Med, as long as we don't end up in a very volatile scenario of with the prospect of a military escalation, the US will be happy to let Europe do the heavy lifting on this. One exception, however, can be on Cyprus, where the US has always been involved, one way or another, regarding the settlement of the political problem on the island, given that the UN has the lead on those negotiations. So going forward, US may have, still a positive role to play if those UN-sponsored negotiations do gain traction. But regarding the other aspect of the Eastern Med, namely, the delimitation of the sea borders, exploration rights, continental shelf issues, and so on, I think the US will be happy to see the EU continue in its diplomatic activism.
Mr. Ülgen, there's another issue which is prominent in US discourse, and which could come up at the summit between President Biden and President Erdoğan, is Iran. Now, from the American dimension, there is the question of the Iran nuclear talks, of course, in which Turkey would appear to be off to the side. It's the European powers, China and Russia, that are involved. But Turkey very much has an interest in Iran because it has faced sanctions on its major state bank, Halkbank, for allegedly evading US sanctions on Iran. I assume it would like to see the punishment lifted on Halkbank. And also Turkey has been involved with Iran, for example, in the political process in Syria, country we just talked about. From the standpoint of Turkey, is it happy to put its interest a little bit behind that of the Americans, in the sense that the Biden administration will be pursuing this Iran nuclear resolution? Or will they push that issue of the sanctions on the Turkish state bank as being a priority?
Well, what we have seen is that with the previous US administration, the Halkbank case was, very much the emphasis of the, during the bilateral talks, even at the presidential level. However, with this US administration, things are likely to be different, because with the Trump administration, I think the Turkish efforts regarding Halkbank were sort of well received by the Trump administration, so much so that the former US president even acted on those, if some of the press reports are correct. Whereas with the Biden administration, things are likely to are likely to be quite different, in the sense that this administration's position will be to be much more standoffish regarding the Halkbank case,
and basically, tell Ankara that this is something that is within the scope of the judiciary, and the administration can do very little about it, and we just have to wait the outcome of the court decision, which haven't started yet. It was supposed to start in May, but because of the COVID situation, it got postponed. So there's still that on the horizon, and depending on the court's, eventual ruling, that might indeed be a new problematic area for the Turkey-US relationship. Having said that, of course, more generally on Iran, there is a congruence of interests because Ankara does want to see the US coming back to the JCPOA. Ankara wants to protect this diplomatic engagement with Iran. What Ankara does not want is a new escalation, especially a military escalation. So from that perspective, there is a congruence of interest. There is also a congruence of interest from the perspective of enlarging the scope of these multilateral negotiations with Iran. As we know, the initial package, the JCPOA, was singularly focused on the nuclear program of Tehran, but there is now the possibility that this scope of negotiations would be enlarged to other issues, including the ballistic missile program of Tehran, but also its regional policies. And those are all areas where Turkey has both a sizable interest, but also quite significant potential contributions to make, given that it is the country that is actually sort of exposed to Iran's regional influence, and both in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, but also is potentially the NATO country that is most threatened by a ballistic missile program of Iran. So when we look at there, that is indeed an area where we do find a congruence of interest, and there can certainly be, if we are to speak about a positive scenario, much more in-depth cooperation between Turkey and the United States, possibly by giving or opening up the floor, because we still don't know what the format this new round of negotiations with Iran will take. There has been quite a bit of reporting and calls for including one way or another the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE. I would argue, if that is the case, you do have a more stronger case to include Turkey one way or another in these talks.
On our tour of issues, if I could ask you about one more, which is the Biden administration for the first time has staked a U.S. position which calls the killings of Armenians in 1915 in the Ottoman Empire, they've called it a genocide. Now, this, of course, has been an issue for decades, which has been, let's say, a symbolic and substantive issue between Turkey and the United States. To what extent is the Erdoğan government unsettled, upset, rattled by that statement?
The genocide word on the 24th of April has been uncharacteristically muted, knowing Erdoğan and also knowing Turkish government's past efforts to essentially preempt such an outcome. Now, why that rather muted reaction? I can think of two reasons. One is that Erdoğan did not want to spoil the atmosphere where Biden promised that this maiden meeting that will take place at the margin of the NATO summit in a few days. That's one reason. And the other reason may have to do with the fragility of the Turkish economy. The Turkish government did not want to get in a political escalation with the United States, which could have had a rather negative impact on the stability of the Turkish currency at a time when Turkey is indeed very vulnerable to a potential foreign exchange shock. So those may be the reasons why we have seen an uncharacteristically muted reaction in Ankara. But at the same time, I think we should add, given what has been said in Ankara after that statement, after Biden's statement, which is that, this is not Turkey's final say, in the sense that Turkey is awaiting the outcome of this first meeting with Biden and may recalibrate its policies and its stance towards Washington after that.
Let me pick up on that reference you made to the Turkish economic situation and go a bit wider with that. We're in a position where there is significant inflation in Turkey. My understanding is it's now above 15% and rising. The lira has dropped significantly in value. There is a giant hole in Turkey's foreign reserves, and there's not exactly stability with Erdoğan apparently changing the head of the central bank yet again and doing this for political rather than economic reasons. To what extent has Turkey lost leverage with the United States and more widely on international issues because the economy is in such a parlous state? In other words, does it simply have no hand to play now because the economic cards are, well, they're just all bad?
Yes, I think there certainly is a linkage between what you see Turkey doing, abroad and how it conducts its foreign policy and the economic situation at home. In other words, when the economy was not so fragile, Turkey had, more room to engage in, assertive and occasionally confrontational foreign policy action. Whether that is with regard to the US, the EU, the Eastern Mediterranean, or even across the Middle East. Of course, now the scope for such more ambitious, assertive, and again, occasionally confrontational policies have narrowed because the impact of this type of more confrontational policy could be that the Turkish economic parameters would be negatively impacted by an escalation with the United States, an escalation with Europe, given also the nature of the Turkish economy. Turkey, in that sense, is not Russia. Turkey needs a functioning market economy. It's an economy that is very much interdependent with the Western economies. Turkey exports, half of its products to Europe. It gets 70% of its foreign direct investment from Europe, another 12% from the United States. So in that sense, the Turkish economy is very much interdependent with the Western economies. And therefore, the politics of, how you construct your foreign relations with which each of these countries matters to a significant degree for Turkey's economic health. Turkey cannot, rest on commodity rents like Russia to really boost its economy, even if it has bad relations with its Western partners. So that's the dilemma of Turkish policymakers, and I think there's acknowledgement of this important linkage between having healthy political relations with the West and the health of the Turkish economy.
Okay, big finish. I know we're not supposed to speculate as analysts, but I'm speaking to you on a day when it appears that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may no longer be Prime Minister next week after more than a decade in office, and there'll be a new coalition government. Is it possible that a year from now, you and I might be discussing a Turkish government in which there is no President Erdoğan at the head? And would that make a difference if Erdoğan was to be pushed aside for a Turkish coalition in which the ruling AKP party was not as influential? Does that change the dynamic of the relationship with the US?
Look, for all democratic nations, and with all its flaws, Turkey remains a democratic country. This is definitely a question that can be discussed. I mean, in all democracies, you expect, power to change through elections. It may or may not happen at the end of the day, but that's nonetheless the core fundamental social contract that undergirds democracy.
So definitely that's something that we should also talk about when the future of Turkey is concerned politically. The next electoral threshold is in 2023, and I think we will not have early elections, so we will have elections on time. And the fundamental reason why we won't have early elections is that right now, again, looking at the polls, Erdoğan does not have an incentive to go to elections because he may very well lose the political leadership. There are now at least 3 other contenders who poll better than Erdoğan. The 2 big the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara, Ekrem İmamoğlu and Mansur Yavaş, they tend to poll about 10 percentage points better than Erdoğan currently. But also the chairperson of İYİ Party, Meral Akşener, she also polls better than Erdoğan at about 4 or 5 points ahead of the Turkish president. So under these conditions, there is no incentive for Erdoğan to go to elections, to early elections. What will happen in 2023 is, obviously anybody's guess, but I think it would be fair to say that it will be the most challenging uphill task for Erdoğan politically to recover the lost ground of the spread that we see today between the ruling alliance and the opposition is going to be difficult to bridge. Especially given economic conditions. The real reason for this, for the spread, it has a lot to do with the economic duress that the country is experiencing. Of course, this has been coupled with the shock of the pandemic, and Turkey did a rather remarkable job in terms on the health side, with the resources that it has, the infrastructure, and so on. But not that greatly on the economic side, with the little support that it was able to give to its citizens, unlike the United States, for instance, or the UK or many European countries that allocated much larger funding in the form of direct income support. That did not happen in Turkey. So as a result, there certainly has been a reaction within public to the economic difficulties that the Turkish population is experiencing. And that's certainly shaping, the political landscape. So the main question is, whether by 2023 Erdoğan will be able to recover the lost ground. That's an open question, because in the past we've never went through such an episode where Erdoğan and the ruling AK Party was so far behind in the polls. That never happened. I think here I have to, I perhaps have to reassess. The AK Party is not behind. The AK Party still is the most popular party, but the coalition, the ruling coalition, AK Party, MHP, is behind the opposition by about 10 percentage points. That's the type of scenario that we never encountered since the emergence of AK Party in 2002. So in that sense, we will definitely live first. Whether Erdoğan will be able to recover or not will determine the fate of the 2023 elections. And if indeed there is political change in Turkey, I think that Turkey's partners in the West, Washington in particular, will take a deep interest in the new Turkish leadership, and will certainly test the waters for establishing, a new set of relations that could possibly be much more collegial, much more consensus-driven than what we have today.
But for now, and barring economic collapse, a 2-year window where it's still Erdoğan and the Biden administration that we look at. Just as a postscript to that, you noted at the very start when we were discussing the Biden administration has the mantra of democracy standing up against authoritarian regimes. Do you think that Joe Biden will take President Erdogan to the side and say, now we know that you say you're a democracy, why don't you be a little bit better in the way that you deal with journalists and dissenters? In other words, why don't you deal a little bit better with human rights? Or do the Americans leave that issue at the door?
No, I think Biden has to do that.
Okay.
For the credibility of his action globally, this is an administration that has put, heavy focus on, on the rule of law, on democracy.
not only externally, but also internally after what happened, obviously, with US democracy on the 6th of January. So I think to remain confident about his program, the US president needs to talk to the Turkish president about the state of democracy and the rule of law.
Sinan Ülgen, thank you so much for that grand tour of US-Turkish relations, including the immediate event at the NATO summit in Brussels. Will you come back and join me a little bit later this year when we can see how much is the same and how much has changed in the aftermath of the Biden-Erdoğan meeting?
Sure, gladly, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. But for now, while we wait to see what happens in the next few weeks, and while we wait to see what we'll be analyzing, let me thank you, the viewers of World Unfiltered, for joining us today. Let me thank the great staff of Deep Dive Politics for putting us on the air. A quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at @dive_politics. You can follow us on Facebook under Deep Dive Politics. You can listen to all of our video broadcasts, if you prefer, in the audio version on Spotify. And of course, there is not only World Unfiltered, but much, much more on our YouTube channel. But for now, I'm Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other.